If everyone can recognise the essential dignity and worth of all human beings, and if everyone can recognise that all human beings have some basic equal rights, then this will lead to freedom, justice and peace in the world. Disrespect for human rights has led to horrific acts that have outraged people across the world. We all want a world where people can enjoy freedom of speech and belief, and freedom from fear and want. If these rights are made law, then people will be protected from tyranny and oppression. It's important that people understand these rights and freedoms, as this will lead to a better, fairer standard of life for everyone. And we've explored human rights in lessons over half-term 1, and most of the examples that we looked at were quite black and white cases where it was very obvious where human rights were being neglected or purposefully overlooked. I'm going to dig a bit deeper this lesson and look at how sometimes it's not that easy to pick a side. So the aim of the lesson, we're going to understand the need to balance different people's human rights, recognise that you need to explore both sides to an argument, and then I want you to evaluate both sides of an argument and decide which side you believe is right. We're going to do this by looking at some real-life case studies, and these case studies were tried in court, and we will hear the verdicts at the end of the lesson. But what I want you to hold in mind throughout the whole lesson is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, we've explored it in class. You've seen many different versions of it, simplified versions, fuller versions. You can take a screenshot of this, but I want you to refer explicitly to the rights that you think are being overlooked or neglected in each case. The first case is the example of kettling to contain young protesters at the climate camp. On the 1st of April 2009, there were 2 demonstrations in the City of London, one near the Bank of England, and this was about how, in the protesters' opinion, the banks in the UK have mismanaged money. The second one was about climate change, and the protesters were asking the governments to do more to protect the environment and prevent climate change. This protest was known as Climate Camp, and it was about a quarter of a mile away from the other protest. The protesters at the bank tried to set fire to the Bank of England offices, they threw missiles and they stole computer equipment. However, in contrast, the climate change protest was very peaceful. There was music being played and there was no violence. The police decided to kettle all the protesters at the Bank of England protest. This meant they forced them to stay in one area and prevented them from moving outside of that area for the whole afternoon. This was to prevent the violence from spreading to other parts of the city and affecting other people. Then the police decided that when the protesters at the Bank of England were allowed to move on, they would start to kettle the protesters at the climate camp. They said this was to prevent the violence from the Bank of England demonstrations spilling over to the climate change protest. So, I want you to outline what both sides to this argument is, and then I want you to decide which side you agree with, which rights are being threatened for either side. So the first is the prosecution. I want you to write a paragraph on behalf of the protesters from the climate camp. You must argue why you think the police were wrong to kettle them. You must persuade the reader that you are right and justify your opinion, which rights were being threatened by kettling them. Then I want you to write a paragraph for the defence lawyers. You're going to speak on behalf of the police. You must argue why you thought it was necessary to kettle the protesters at the climate camp. Persuade the reader that you are right and justify your opinion with specific reference to which rights were being threatened by the protesters. So I want you to pause here and write 2 paragraphs. I want you to look at your 2 paragraphs now and decide which one do you believe in? Which one do you think is the strongest argument? Which side would win if this went to court? And again, we will refer back to this at the end of the lesson when we look at what the rulings actually were. Second case study, hitting children is part of my religion. Corporal punishment, hitting children if they break the rules, is against the law in UK schools. There was a group of head teachers, parents and teachers at 4 different schools who took a case to court claiming that this law was against their Christian religion. It breached their human rights. They felt that parents should be allowed to decide whether or not their children could be hit by teachers as a punishment. The parents and teachers argued that certain sections in the Bible say it is important to discipline children by hitting them, so that they learn how to behave properly. He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. Proverbs 13:24. The other side of the argument is that the law against corporal punishment is there to protect the rights of children. Experts say that hitting children as a punishment causes distress, pain, and has other harmful effects. It may lower self-esteem and is liable to instill hostility and rage without reducing the undesired behaviour. So, again, I want you to create 2 paragraphs, one for the prosecution, one for the defence. The prosecution, I want you to argue on behalf of the parents. Why do parents have the right to decide how their children are punished? And then for the defence, I want you to speak on behalf of the children. Why do you need protecting from physical punishment? And in both cases, I want you to persuade the reader you are right and justify your opinion with reference to the specific human rights that are being violated. You can pause here and write 2 paragraphs. I want you to look at your paragraphs and decide which one do you believe in. If you were in court, which way would you rule? Would you rule for the parents or for the children? Next case study. Rio Ferdinand, he was captain of the England football team in 2010. The Sunday Mirror wrote an article about him and a relationship he was having with someone called Carly Story. According to the article, Carly was still Rio's girlfriend even after he married Rebecca Ellison. The newspaper said that in 2006, Rio had a wild reputation as someone with lots of different girlfriends. But in an interview with another newspaper, he claimed he was no longer like that and he vowed not to cheat on his wife. The newspaper claimed that Rio was lying and he was still being unfaithful to his wife and he hadn't changed at all. Rio Ferdinand took the Sunday Mirror to court, claiming that the newspaper had breached his human rights by publishing stories about his private life. The Sunday Mirror argued that they had a right to print the story because they were correcting the public image that Rio had created of himself as a family man, and they felt this was false. They questioned whether he was a good enough role model to be captain of the England football team. So again, I want you to create a paragraph arguing both sides of the argument. For the prosecution, I want you to argue on behalf of Rio Ferdinand. Persuade the reader that his human rights have been abused by the newspaper. Justify your opinion by referencing specific human rights. And then the defence, I want you to speak on behalf of the newspaper. I want you to argue why you think people have the right to hear what you have to say about Rio Ferdinand. Again, I want you to pause here and write 2 separate paragraphs. If you have a look at those paragraphs, decide which side of the argument do you fall on, which do you believe the strongest. Next case study, the quality of life for 2 young disabled girls. So there's 2 young girls, aged 11 and 13, with severe learning and physical disabilities. They lived at home and needed 24-hour care, and they needed help with all activities of daily life. They had care workers from the council who would come in and help the family. At home, they used a hoist to lift the girls from bed to bath. But they also enjoyed swimming, horse riding and shopping. And because there was no hoist available if they were out of the house, their care workers often had to lift them. The council brought in a new rule which said that they would no longer let any of their care workers do any heavy lifting, and this was designed to protect the health of the council workers in general, but it also meant that they couldn't take the girls out of the house. The girls' family took the council to court, claiming that the ban on lifting was affecting the girls' quality of life and their human rights. Same as before, I want you to argue for the prosecution on behalf of the girls and their family. Persuade the reader that the actions of the council were against the girls' human rights and justify your opinions. And then on behalf of the defence, I want you to speak on behalf of the council. I want you to persuade us that the ban on lifting was necessary to protect the rights of the council's care workers and justify your opinions. So if you pause here and write 2 paragraphs. Again, I want you to look at those and decide which one do you feel is the strongest argument. So let's look back at the first case. Have a look at your notes. What did you argue? What did you feel was the right course of action? It was a real case, it was tried in court, and at first the court ruled that the police kettle or containment of the climate camp protesters was unnecessary and unlawful. The judge commented that the tactics used were unduly inflexible and used unjustified force. It is legal for police to use kettling, but as a last resort if there is a real risk of violence, and the judge in this case felt that the risk was not high enough to justify its use. The rights of the protesters that were relevant in this case were the right to meet together in a peaceful way, Article 11, the right to express your views and opinions, Article 10, and the right to liberty and security, Article 5. Any limits placed on these rights must be necessary and proportionate, and the judge had to balance these against the general need for public order and safety. However, in December 2011, the police appealed against this decision, and a different judge decided that the kettling of the climate camp protesters had been justified because the two protests were only a quarter of a mile apart and there had been some links between them. They were advertised on the same website with similar names. They had been part of a group of protests happening around that time. So they said the police acted in good faith because there was a real risk of breach of peace. And here we can see that even two different judges had different opinions. So initially they ruled against the police, and then when the police appealed, a different judge ruled in favour of the police. Again, do your notes reflect that? Was that a difficult one for you to decide, or did you think it was quite cut and dry? Next court case was the hitting children is part of my religion, and the court ruled against the parents and teachers who wanted to use corporal punishment. The judges accepted that the law against corporal punishment did interfere with their right to freedom of religion under Article 9, but this right had to be balanced against the rights of the children. The statutory ban had a legitimate aim. Children are vulnerable, and the aim of the legislation is to protect them and promote their well-being. Corporal punishment involved deliberately inflicting physical violence, and the legislation was intended to protect children against the distress, pain, and other harmful effects that physical violence may cause. So the judges put the children's rights, particularly Article 3, the right not to be tortured or treated in a way which is cruel or humiliating, above the parents' rights to hold on to their religious beliefs. Rio Ferdinand, the judge ruled in favour of the Sunday Mirror in this case. The judge had to balance Rio's right to a private and family life, Article 8, against the newspaper's right to express their own views and opinions, Article 5. In this instance, the judge found that, although the claimant's right to a private and family life was relevant, there was also a public interest in correcting a false image promoted by the claimant. So it was also held that the article contributed to a debate as to the claimant's fitness to be a role model in the light of his appointment as an England football captain. So basically, do we want someone who is dishonest and having affairs to be captain of the England football team? So did that surprise you? Is that what you were expecting? Have a look back at your notes and see if you found that argument the most convincing. And the last one, the quality of life of the two young disabled girls, the judge had to weigh up the girls' right to a private and family life, Article 8, with the safety of the health of the care workers. The judge ruled in favour of the girls and said that the ban on lifting would have to be modified in order to allow the care workers to do some safe lifting that would enable them to participate in the leisure and cultural activities that others can enjoy. Article 14 is also relevant here because the girls had a right not to be discriminated against because of their disabilities. The judge also mentioned that the refusal to lift the girls could have an impact on their rights under Article 2 or 3 if they fell or were forced to remain in an unsafe or embarrassing situation. So, in summary, I want you to think back over those case studies. It's not always as clear-cut as we think, but I want you to think as your exit note, did any of those verdicts surprise you? If they did, why did they? What were you expecting? If you would have ruled differently, why would you have ruled differently? Do you think you could have argued that in court and still won? And if these verdicts didn't surprise you, why not? Is it because you've got a good understanding of the Declaration of Human Rights, or is it because you've got a good understanding of the complexities of the different cases, or are you just good at arguing? Have a think and decide. And if you were correct in all of these, maybe there is a career